this accessible to folks. Thank you. All right, so this session is going to be on community gardening. And as we've been doing for every session, I just want to, again, point out our Urban Food Policy Council members in the room. Megan, are you there? Yes.
I am here. Hi. Thanks y'all for joining us. I've got a little background noise outside going on, so I'm going to leave it on mute.
Thank you. We also have Brandon Williams, who will be co-facilitating the session today. If you want to wave, Brandon.
Yes. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm eager to introduce Cameron Waters of Cooperative Extension, the community garden coordinator.
Cameron,
I'm anxious to see what she has to share with us today.
We also have Carol Eichmeyer. If you want to wave, hello, and Reverend David Harrison.
Hey, everybody.
We also actually have Michael Banner. I know he's multitasking right now, but Michael Banner's joined. He has some waves oh, there he is. Hey, Michael.
Good morning. Good morning. We're close to afternoon.
Thank you for being here. All right. Well, I'm going to go ahead and pull up the slides and we can get started. And do you want to just jump right in again, Brandon, with Cameron?
Absolutely. Let's go. I want to introduce Cameron Waters, the North Carolina Cooperative Extension Community Garden Coordinator. And we're going to go over some Forsyth Community Garden aspects, and I'm sure she'll give you a thorough overview. I'm anxious to see what she has to share. So Cameron, I'll let you go ahead and take it from here.
Great, thanks. Yeah, thanks everyone for being here. And yeah, I'm just excited to chat a little bit. I am the Community Gardening Program Coordinator for North Carolina Cooperative Extension Forsyth County Center. And so today I'm going to talk a little bit about the program, why we garden, the program as it exists now, and then how we can move forward collectively to build and strengthen the community garden program to have a voice in the future of our food system, especially when it comes to food security and food access. So you can go to the next slide. So first, I just want to talk about, why do we garden in the first place? And I feel like I'm kind of speaking to like-minded folks. I'm preaching to the choir essentially, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this. But there is a lot of literature about the health and wellness benefits, about being outside, about engaging with your peers, working in the soil, things like that. As Mary Jack really eloquently put in her urban farming presentation this morning about the environmental benefits of gardening or just cultivating green space in the urban core in terms of like more permeable surfaces and things like that. And gardens are also really great demonstration spaces for alternative methods of sustainable agriculture that provide solutions to the environmental destruction caused by urban farming or by urbanized systems of farming. But what's most salient today in terms of our conversation is first the community building aspect of community gardening, right? So it's really identifying a common ground and space for conversation, a space for folks to work together and engage with really complex topics like resilience and adaptability in super gentle ways through gardening, and to facilitate, intergenerational learning, conversations and connections with folks in your community that maybe you don't spend that much time with. And also in terms of food access and food justice, as gardening does have the potential to promote or increase household access to produce that is fresh, local, affordable, and culturally relevant. You can go to the next slide. So I do want to kind of ground us in the space that we're in Forsyth County and talk about why we garden specifically in Forsyth County. As you know, I don't need to overstate this, that hunger is a really prominent issue that our community faces in terms of food access. And so the red on this map are identified food insecure areas, meaning that a third of the population lives more than a mile away from a grocery store. And so really, how does community gardening tie into this, right? And so folks in these areas can start community gardens, or folks even outside these areas can start donation gardens as well to try to supplement the lack of access to fresh produce and work alongside those folks that are working to kind of dismantle those systemic and structural barriers that cause food insecurity. So it's really a holistic approach, working in concert with other folks also while gardening. And so this kind of brings up the different types of community gardens that we have. And so you can have, a lot of folks think about donation gardens, right? And so a group of folks getting together and donating all their produce to immediate hunger relief organizations. But also what we've seen in Forsyth County is in a lot of limited resource areas, the gardens are started by the neighborhoods themselves. And so the food stays in the community as it's shared between those participating in the community garden and their neighbors. And this ultimately promotes feelings of self-sufficiency on the path of food sovereignty. You can go to the next slide. Another reason why we garden in Forsyth County is because we are living in an increasingly developing and urbanized county, right? So according to the Census of Agriculture, in 1950, there were about 182,000 acres for farming, but in 2012, it's about 40,000. And concurrently, there was an 80% loss in the total number of farms in the county from about 3,400 to under 550. And you can see on the graph, only about 160 of those farms as of 2017 had a net cash gain. And so what do we do given this context, right? Where farming is kind of moving out of the county. There aren't the large scale farms that we typically think of. And I think this really resonates with Mary Jack's work. And her presentation earlier today is that we at Extension and also as a community support home growers, homesteaders, small farms, and community gardens. And this was really where out of this community need and this understanding that our county was changing, we decided to shift and start the community gardening program. And this happened at Extension long before I was there, about 10 years ago. You can go to the next slide. Okay, so now I'm gonna transition to talk a little about our program specifically. And so first I wanna address the question of like how we define what is a garden, right? If you wanna start a garden, then sometimes, they ask like, what is your criteria? So my favorite definition of a community garden is from the Brooklyn Botanic Gardens Community Garden Guide, which is anywhere a community of people joins together to garden. And that is intentionally broad. The language is really intentionally vague because there's no definition of what your community has to look like in order to be able to garden. There's no really criteria for what your site has to look like, no expectations of production necessarily. And this really opens up space, right? It opens up space for what your community can look like. And it puts the onus on community rather than the garden, because in 6 months, if you don't have a community around it, you will just have a vacant plot. And this really puts the power back into the community that's starting the garden. It identifies those that are benefit from the garden as the designers of the space, as those who are cultivating the community of the garden, the culture in the garden as well. And they're the key decision makers and implementers of that change. Tiffany, I don't know if you can click that link. It's not necessary, but.
Yeah, I can do it. Let me see. I'm gonna have to change the way it's sharing here. Let me stop real quick and then go to the link.
Okay, sorry about that.
No problem. All right, here we are.
Okay, great. So this is our story map, and you can just scroll down. So this is an interactive map that is going to live on the Map Forsyth website.
What I realized is I pulled it up on Edge, and Edge does not support maps.
That's okay. You can just go back to the presentation. I can just talk about it.
I can also pop it in the chat real quick.
Great, yeah. So this is, the green is obviously the map of the county, and the red are identified foods insecure areas, and the green stars are all of our community gardens. I just kind of wanted everyone to get a map overview of what our network looks like at the moment. And the houses, the little house icons or any kind of community service center. So this exists on a separate map as well on Map Forsyth of community service assets, but I wanted to put them on there that are affordable housing units, food pantries, etc. And so it's nice to see that that the cluster of community gardens are really central, and they're also, the work is occurring where the need is as well. And so as you see, like the overlay comparing food insecurity and lack of food access, gardens are starting to form. And so it's interesting to see that the donation or the food grown is not coming inward, it's coming from within the community, which is kind of the bottom up approach that we were going for. So the network currently exists of a little over 80 community gardens, community and school gardens. And just for a breakdown, we have 34 that are entirely donation. And so they partner with Hope of Winston-Salem, Campus Kitchen, other food relief or food distribution and hunger relief organizations in the county. 21 are youth and school gardens, and 15 emerged from neighborhoods, and the produce remains in the community. And so we're currently working on 9 developing projects. And I kind of wanted to share the list of these 9 developing spaces so that everyone can get an understanding of how diverse the garden communities are. So we have Positive Wellness Alliance, which is a regional association serving folks impacted by HIV and AIDS. The new El Buen Pastor Latino Community Services Center. Neighborhoods Hands, which is an anti-hunger nonprofit in the area, 3 elementary schools, 2 early childhood education centers, and the reclamation site for the old Haynes Lawrence Middle School on Indiana Drive. So this really demonstrates the power and the diversity that the community garden spans across. So you know, there are multiple voices represented, multiple interests in like why folks garden, their motivations are all unique. Every garden has their own kind of statement of need, their own agenda that's not informed by me or by extension. It's really run completely individually. You can go to the next slide. So just a little bit about extension. And why it exists. So historically, gardens typically, they don't really work out when there's a lack of understanding of and adaptation to local conditions, right? So that's why we have extension in every county in North Carolina, because it's kind of this connection between the research at the land grant schools and the growers. And so it's really place specific. This work is super oriented in Forsyth County. And so that's why we have extension agents to talk not only about the place specific nature in terms of horticulture, but also garden establishment and management strategies that are suited for the local environment in terms of social and resource supply conditions. So really my job is less on the horticulture side, and it's more on the garden management side. And so before anything gets planted, we have to take inventory of the community that's, you know, geographically based and place-based, and understand the talent and resources that already exist in the community, map those out, and then make those community partnerships that would support the garden for its long-term sustainability. So what we supply right now through the gardening program, first, gardening resources. That's tools, seeds, transplants, anything we can get donated in terms of compost, garden frames, those immediate inputs. I would love to focus on getting some community shared, like larger, increasing access to those needs that you have, like wood chips, leaf mulch, things like that, that are consistent needs year after year. You know, and there are other things that you need at a garden to thrive, like a truck and labor and volunteers and access to water. And some of those things, you know, we're trying to get shared on like more of a community level. And so we're working on that and pulling resources. We also have a mentor program that trains garden leaders in sustainable horticulture and garden leadership, or provides them access to those mentors. We also have community events, workshops. The workshops are pretty heavy on asset-based community development, community organizing, garden organizing, but also with some horticulture components as well. no matter where a garden is in terms of its experience. So if they're just in the generative stages and just getting started, or if they've been growing for 3 years, they always have access to extension. We always do site visits with them, provide them as much support as possible. And then we have a newsletter, and then they're connected to anything that extension has to offer beyond gardening as well. You can go to the next slide. So my overarching goal personally, but also that we've identified at Extension for the program, is to ensure that community members in the program obtain nutritious food through safe and culturally acceptable means, while also incorporating environmentally sustainable techniques in an economically and socially just manner, right? So how can we make gardening accessible, low cost, low risk, but also relevant to every different community that is gardening? So the 5 steps that I kind of identified that are repeated time and time again and happen concurrently are consistent community engagement, always checking back in with our stakeholders, checking in with gardens, assistance with components of garden organizing in every stage, from getting started to sustaining the garden long-term, education and trainings in both agroecological production methods, but also community leadership, participation and connection to the larger network, right? Every garden does have its own leadership, it has its own community, but then how do we build that larger body of folks? And this is, oftentimes facilitated by recognition and celebration of success along the way. In terms of donation size, in terms of grants that you get, just making it through, 3 full seasons, or 3 full seasons of gardening, if that's possible, and just celebrating each other's work. The next goal is for expansion of the garden network. Obviously, any self-identified community that identifies a garden as a need for them, we want to support them in establishing their garden, whether it be just a space in their neighborhood, at their community site, at a school. But I want to kind of expand in a different way as well. We want all of our community members to identify as skilled gardeners, to see themselves as change makers when conducting community inventories, and really identify the myriad of talent and resources that's coming from within their community, rather than seeing Extension or myself or the garden program as a resource that they rely on. The next is adoption of best practices. This refers to good agricultural practices, of course, but also shared leadership and community-based decision-making. And so this is best practices for both sustainable horticulture, but also sustainable community engagement and development. The next is reciprocal community partnerships. We really want to foster those since this work is so community-driven, right? So we want to build linkages between people, institutions, and organizations so that gardens can have access to different resources across the community or across the county, especially funding, especially access to higher, structural changes and things like that. So it's really about mapping what type of work is being done, where it's being done, who's involved, who can the gardeners connect with, how can they connect with each other, and establishing this kind of community forum that will hopefully act as a gateway to civic agriculture, right? So that's becoming more aware of the individual and the collective involvement in the larger food system. So this is kind of, this is about having a collective body of gardeners that have a plan and a voice and momentum that of a network of microcosms that serve as under this umbrella of community gardening, and how can that influence food policy and represent a number of different voices in the food future for Forsyth County. You can go to the next slide. So this is just how to get involved if this resonates with folks. So there's just a number of ways: volunteering, joining a garden, starting a garden, becoming a trained mentor is really helpful. The structure of the mentor program is kind of changing, but we do, we still need trained mentors that are willing to serve multiple gardens at a time, but also uplifting current garden leaders, donating extra produce, participating in a horticulture or a community garden leadership training, subscribing to our newsletter. There are multiple ways to get plugged in, and we're always, hoping to expand our community and our network. And that's my contact information down there if anyone has any questions or just wants to work with me a bit closer when it comes to gardening. Great.
Wow, I think that was a great presentation. Cam, what are some of the ways that people can participate in community garden? I know we have, you have different situations in terms of school, religious-based, community-based. So what are some of the different types of options that one would have or a group may have to kind of participate in that community garden as an overview?
Yeah, it's been really interesting to get that feedback. So the main gardens that I work with are based in neighborhoods or like a YMCA or a community kind of building, like what's the word I'm looking for? A community center, right? Or they're faith-based groups or their schools. And so sometimes the entry point is a little bit challenging for folks to find if their neighborhood doesn't have a community garden. And so essentially what happens is they can reach out to me and we will match them, or I will match them with a garden that's in their area and fits their interests. So if they want like really hands-on leadership, then I would match them with an entirely community garden where they all work together. If they want to grow food for themselves or their family, I would match them with a garden that has allotment spaces. So they can kind of, they can work with others, but they have like their own space. And so we have a kind of a matching process. And so that's really what we focus on if that makes sense.
Now, in terms of getting started, like if one were to have a community garden, is that something with the cooperative extension where one could access tools, for example, tool lending or seeds in that regards? Can you kind of enlighten us on that?
Yeah, so if they're interested in starting a community garden, they can work with myself or anyone from Extension from the first time they have that idea, right? So we would sit down and talk with them about the site, evaluate who owns the site, and getting in contact with them, seeing if the land is available for use, and then forming that core team. So that's like 5 to 7 people that are dedicated to starting the garden with you. And that's really essential to the long-term sustainability of the garden. And then we move next into designing what kind of garden you want this to be, what best serves the community, what need is being met, and then engaging with other community members and kind of getting their interest a bit. So once all that planning has really first come into play and is completed, then you really start to understand what the community wants from it, if there's buy-in from the community. And then that's kind of where we start like 6 months later into actually planting the garden. And then we do provide tools, seeds, we can source donations for frames, for lumber, for irrigation equipment. And so we do have biannual seed distributions. We have an ongoing tool lending program. So those things, we have free soil testing, things like that. We are looking to source community piles of, like I said, wood chips and leaf mulch that aren't currently available, but we're in conversation about that and where we would, it essentially comes down to just where we would store it.
Now, in terms of some of the series, if one was to get started in the community garden initiative, can you kind of segue into or introduce us to some of the series that you guys have that kind of serve as a educational piece to kind of keep us up to speed in terms of the community garden dynamics?
Yeah. So right now we have adult ed at the Arboretum, which is hosted by our ornamental horticulture agent. We also have the Piedmont Spring Gardening Series, which is every Thursday until the end of this month, but they're recorded and you have access to them whenever you want. And that's home gardening, community gardening. It's just basic horticultural components like planting, growing great tomatoes, herbs, things like that. Really the basics of gardening for the spring. I'm hosting, along with another agent in Guilford County, a series called Growing Beyond Veggies. So that's really about community development. So it's about garden planning, volunteer recruitment, designing gathering spaces to make folks feel really engaged and safe in the space. And then later in the spring, I'm having a workshop for school garden educators about social emotional learning and alternative school gardening. And then we have NC Leadership Academy in the summer, which is essentially asset-based community development and garden organizing. And that's all on the extension website and is in my newsletter. I know that was a mouthful, so I will.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Tiff, what, you gonna say something?
I do want to ask a question, and sorry if I missed you mentioning this, but can you talk about measures that you can put in place to kind of ensure the long-term sustainability of a garden? I know sometimes there's challenges with community members moving out or, you know, them just fizzling out. So how can we plan to ensure that?
Yeah, so one of the kind of the cornerstones of that is no garden is started without a core team and community buy-in that's been demonstrated. And that it really is about front loading it with that organization, that planning. So I know that's kind of difficult because a lot of the gardens have already been established. So that's kind of moving forward. But with the gardens that are already established, you know, folks move away or the garden kind of fizzles out, we try to do active community engagement, although the garden already exists. So that's asking your neighbors what they want to see from the garden, what kind of crops they want to be grown, what's limiting their entrance into interacting with the garden, right? So what are their barriers to entry? And if it's time and if it's resources, what are some alternatives to share, to identifying other talents and resources in the community, like childcare, or something like that, so that folks can participate in the garden when they have time. And so it's really about community buy-in and community engagement is the cornerstone of long-term sustainability for a garden. It really, you know, like I said, you know, in 6 months, if you don't have the community around it, it will just be a garden. It'll be an untended garden. And so it's about consistently revisiting your stakeholders and the community members to see what you can, how you can continue to foster those relationships.
Great. And with you saying that, could you kind of briefly share with us some different types of community gardens in terms of religious, faith-based, educational, and ways to kind of really go through those entrance criteria?
Yeah. So a lot of the gardens we have, so the donation-based gardens come from YMCAs, like I said, community centers, or neighborhoods of folks that have the time and resources to garden, and then they focus mostly on bulk donations. Then we have faith-based groups, and that's typically on land that the organization owns. And so those are really popular, and they will feed typically food pantries that already exist at the center as well. So a lot of United Methodist churches, Baptist churches, things like that in Forsyth County have their own food pantries. And so it's like a reciprocal relationship all within the church. And then we also have, there's some good examples of organizations that have gardens as well. Positive Wellness Alliance, Latinx Community Services, Hope of Winston-Salem, and Second Harvest all have gardens on their organization site. And so those are either they're usually community service centers already, and then they use that to supplement their food pantry and their clients that already exist in the community or live close to the service center. But I should clarify, because folks who want to volunteer can volunteer at sites like Positive Wellness Alliance or Hope. You can go, you don't have to be a member of the organization just to volunteer at the garden if they're serving their audiences.
Great. Now, in terms of gleaning, are you familiar with that concept of gleaning?
So I'm familiar with gleaning from grocery stores. Like, so I know Brad Shugal's on here, and he can probably speak about gleaning better than I can. Which I know that Campus Kitchen sources unsaleable produce from grocery stores and prepares meals. Is that what you're talking about? Or are you talking about gleaning from small farms?
Yes, for small farms.
Yeah, so that's kind of outside of my job description. So I don't really deal with small farms.
No
Um,
problem.
yeah.
What about, when we're looking in terms of getting started in community gardens, as far as, resource management, organizational, management, what would you kind of suggest in terms of trying to sustain a volunteer group? Or can you kind of go over some of the basic principles that one would need to establish in order to impute a good community garden?
Yeah. So I think it's really identifying your garden statement of purpose. That really resonates with folks who look at that map that I showed. And if you have your kind of mission statement, that will attract the volunteers that want to work with you, right? And so they're really varied across all the gardens, but that's the best way is to have a clear vision so that you can attract the community that will engage with what you're doing time and time again. And so I think that's best for sourcing outside volunteers. So we have a number of partnerships with Wake Forest, with Piedmont Environmental Alliance, and other groups like that that funnel volunteers into our program. And so that's the best way to supplement for gardens that don't have high volunteer retention for a number of factors, right? Like not everyone has time to volunteer if they have work or they have kids and things like that. And so we do want to supplement volunteers to the gardens that are in immediate need of volunteers and just extra hands. I would say having that clear vision, though, also that's community informed, will keep your community volunteers coming back time and time again. And so asking, not one person can keep a garden going. You have to ask the community, what purpose is this garden serving? And making sure that they feel like as though the mission statement of the garden speaks to them. And so that's how you kind of keep the volunteers coming back, is if they believe in that mission and they believe in the goal of the garden, and they really feel as though they're serving the collective purpose.
Now, in terms of cooperative extension, what will be some of the key roles in terms of function that they will be able to help facilitate a community who would like to establish a community garden?
Yeah, so we do our best to support those folks who want to start community gardens through every stage of planning. So kind of like I described the process earlier, of giving about 6 months before you actually plant anything. And so that's why we offer the mentor training and NC Leadership Academy typically in the winter months, so that folks who are interested in starting a garden or taking on a leadership role can have that training and then move with momentum into the planting season for the spring. So at Extension, we provide them leadership training, horticultural training, access to all the agents in terms of livestock, soil, things like that. Like really any agricultural question, any horticultural question you have, you can get answered at Extension. And then you have consistent engagement and support from myself to check in with your community garden. And we have our monthly meetings to facilitate like networking and community sharing of ideas. I think Mary Jack kind of mentioned in her presentation that if you bring a bunch of farmers or growers into one space, they're just going to talk shop, right? And so what's really the best way to grow community is me just inviting everyone into one space, to preferably a garden, so that we can have a tour and we can showcase the success of a garden. And then everyone can just talk amongst each other. It's really in like a non-hierarchical structure. So we're moving past Extension being this like arbiter, this like one source of information, and instead fostering that a lot of the talent and knowledge exists within our network already. So there are some gardeners who are super experienced, more experienced than I am, and just have been doing this much longer than I have. And if they show up at one of our monthly meetings or our community meetings, they can talk about growing great tomatoes and facilitate that in a really informal way, which fosters learning in a different way than if I was just standing up in front of them lecture style talking about growing tomatoes. So
Great. So do you feel as though those who have the community gardens, what do you feel as though may be the best way to kind of broadcast or kind of promote that network of community gardens? What would you kind of suggest, in terms of us all?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, because extension is like, it's like not hip. I don't know another way to say it. It's not like super culturally relevant anymore. It's a very long-standing institution in the state of North Carolina, and actually North Carolina has a great extension network, but not a lot of people know about it. I don't know. Not a lot of people know about it. And so when they finally find out about extension, they're like, oh my gosh, there's so many resources that are free. And I'm so excited I finally found out about extension. And so I think that is just a note to us to form community partnerships, right? And so advertising community garden volunteer opportunities on Love Out Loud or Hands on Northwest North Carolina and things like that, and like gently introducing them to extension as an entity that's there to support them, forming partnerships with schools, with different nonprofits, participating in their community days, showing up at the community events for the churches, for the community service centers that have gardens, and just making ourselves a bit more relevant, I think. And also just in terms of individual gardens, those that are really successful at bringing in volunteers do have social media, they have websites, they have their own newsletters. They advertise at, they advertise in the surrounding area at local businesses, and they partner with them and things like that. So it's really just about, making those relationships just outside of extension.
Now, as far as moving forward in terms of like edible landscaping and things of that nature, a lot of times, people want to pursue community garden is a feasible option to food security. So what would you suggest in terms of those core values or ways to kind of, if I want to get started in doing something in my backyard and in my front yard, what would you kind of suggest of some of the core values or some of the core elements that I need to kind of incorporate to get that started?
Yeah, I think one part of your question that really resonates is community gardening a feasible way of providing legitimate food access, right? That's sustainable. And I think that is probably a larger conversation, and that could be an entirely different summit, right? Of can community gardening sustain or provide long-term food access? And I think that gardening can exist in conversation with dismantling some of those larger structural barriers to food access. I think that while we also work to provide, to ameliorate, the fact that there's so many food deserts in Forsyth County, we can also supplement the need with community gardens. But it has to happen kind of together rather than just garden. Just establishing gardens won't necessarily dismantle those structures that exist. And so I think that we do have to work kind of as a collective, community gardens represented as well in the larger food systems work. So just to answer that kind of part of your conversation, but if you are interested in starting a garden or gardening at home, I would definitely say first connect with Extension to get your soil tested. Mary Jack went through a really great kind of chronological process of how you start identifying a site that gets 8 to 10 hours of sunlight, has reliable access to water, is relatively flat. And if you have any questions about that, an extension agent, and if it's community garden related, I will come out and survey the site with you and help determine if it's a viable site for a garden. And then we'll get the soil tested, and then we'll work together to make a plan that uses the space best, right? And so another barrier to kind of why gardens sometimes don't work is that they're not designed in a way that uses space effectively, and also is not designed in a way that is adaptive to the local conditions of Forsyth County in terms of its planning, as well as in terms of its community planning, as well as its design.
Now, with that being said, by you being an affiliate with the North Carolina Cooperative, well, Forsyth County Cooperative Extension, what would you say will be some of the underutilized resources that some of those who, would like to be engaged in community gardening that can take advantage of that they haven't thus far? Can you share some of those resources and some of those opportunities with us?
Yeah. I think that I think the main one is the workshop, the programming. So every agent is required to do programming. Mine specifically, I try to make it as community informed as possible. And so really listening to what's going on in the gardens right now, what are they interested in, partnering with our horticulture agent to talk more about maybe the horticulture specific issues they might be facing, but also consistently revisiting long-term sustainability goals of a garden. And that's why we do leadership training. I would say the programming is the best asset that Extension provides. And this doesn't just happen at the office, right? And so I know my predecessor, Megan, she did a lot of on-site demonstrations for specific garden communities. And so if they had a specific area that they were interested in, right, they wanted to do like a Three Sisters project with corn and beans and squash, she would go and plant with them and have like a work day out of it and demonstrate it in the garden, which makes it way more accessible. And so there's just a wealth of knowledge that exists at Extension, and they can really meet you where you're at, right? Like they can come to your site and do the demonstration. But it really is just about reaching out and making those partnerships.
Great. I really appreciate that, Cameron. Does anybody have any input or any questions or anything they want to add? Now, let me ask you something, Cameron. In terms of the organizational part, what would you say has been the most challenging part? I know you surveyed some of the community stakeholders. What would you say has been the most challenging part in terms of trying to establish and sustain a community garden?
I think it's acknowledging that community development is an ongoing process rather than just like a linear process, right? And so even if so that would typically happen as like gardens kind of end up being under the leadership of one person. And is one person doing the work and relying on a couple really like kind volunteers to come back and help them time and time again, right? And so, and they say, well, I had this great group at the beginning and they were super excited, and then it kind of fizzled out. And that's okay, like that happens, and there's no solution that I have or that anyone really has, like that's just going to happen. But once you feel the interest or the impact of the garden kind of diminishing or the community diminishing a little bit, it's about being mindful of that, and then having a meeting or reaching out to those stakeholders and saying, what's going on, what are the barriers, have what's changed to where you're unable or uninterested in gardening anymore. And accepting them where they're at, and that's okay. And if they just want to transition to something else, you have to go back, not to the beginning necessarily, but to that consistent community engagement and surveying, is this something that people are still interested in? Do we need to change our direction instead of being, just an allotment space where it feels a little bit disconnected? Do we need to transition to growing in-ground community beds for donation? Is that what people are more interested in now? So how do we shift our focus to meet the interests of the community, right? And so it really is a process. It's not just we've identified the need for a garden and it's going to be the same in 2 years, because it probably won't, considering how much our county is changing, how much the community is changing, the understanding of food systems and local foods is changing so much. And so it's really just about consistent reevaluation, which is not necessarily that fun. I think that, the point of a garden is sometimes to not have to think about those things, to not think about organizing and not thinking about like clerical stuff like that. It's just about getting outside. And so that also ties back into evaluating the strengths of your community, because there will be one person who's maybe great at getting volunteers, but they don't really care about actually gardening. And then there are some people who just want to come outside on the weekends and work. So it's just about being mindful of understanding the community and its resources and its needs.
Wow, thank you, Cam. That I really appreciate that. Tiff, do you have anything to add?
We do have a question in the chat. Brad said, do you see connections in terms of a network between the gardens, or is it most of the focus on building community within a single garden community?
Yeah, that's a great question. So at the moment, what I see is the focus is on building community within a single garden, right? So the community wants to come together around a garden in their community, which is great, which is, you know, lovely and encourages community development or community engagement on that scale. And I think a goal for myself and a goal for Extension is to foster that kind of larger community within community gardens, right? That we're all working together collectively. And that's a slow moving process, especially, you know, a lot has changed and gardens have slowed down in the past couple of years just because of the pandemic. But as things are reviving, you know, folks really want to get out and engage with each other. And I really see that I can facilitate that community just by holding space for people. That's really what it's about. Because once you bring gardeners together, they really want to make those connections with each other and learn from each other just organically. It seems to be in the nature of being a gardener is that you want to make those connections and identify them. And so how can I facilitate that is really the question for my role. But it is a longer term goal of having that larger network of all the gardens and also the folks who are working in, you know, hunger relief organizations and food systems work. And so that's long-term vision.
Thank you. I don't have any additional questions. I don't know if anyone else from the group has questions or thoughts related to community gardens. I see you're talking, Christopher, but we can't hear you, or at least I can't. No. Brandon, you're also on mute.
Cameron, let me ask you a question. You know, we've discovered that as far as water, well, that's one of the greatest interest criteria in terms of supporting either urban farm or community garden, but more specifically community garden. Due to the relapses on or availability to, you know, hydration, what would be the best way to go about securing the water? You know, because a lot of times, you know, personally, you know, one of the biggest challenges is in terms of starting a community garden is being able to have access to water. So if you could share with us some of those caveats and ways to access that, I appreciate it.
Yeah, that is such a good question. And that's something that's come up in the Forsyth Food Chats conversation as well. From what I understand, at some point, I think probably Tiffany can correct me, but there was some kind of proposal to provide access to water that was sponsored by either the county or the city in limited resource neighborhoods that were looking to start gardens. I don't know if that was just an idea. Mary Jack talked about it.
It was through the fire hydrants, but again, that's been.
Yeah, it was a hydrant situation because, you know, I had a personal experience with that. But as far as, you know, we have a lot of hydrants. But a lot of times when we're dealing with water conservation and water and, you know, accessibility, that can kind of determine, you know, which way you're growing, you know, your outcomes go, you know. So a lot of times, you know, you have a lot of people, and what I've discovered in terms of community gardenship is that being able to have the access to water, hydration, you know. So I know I've dealt with some in the educational capacity and some in the community capacity, and that like we discovered recently that there's no more, correct me if I'm wrong, Tiffany, there's not really that option to really use those hydrants as once before. So it's kind of, it's a different dichotomy now. So it's like, are we looking more towards water conservation, or if we're looking towards more, I don't know. I just want to kind of get you, I want to kind of, solicit your feedback on that in terms of how we're looking moving forward in this new paradigm.
Yeah, I think, when it comes to rainwater catchment or cisterns or things like that, there is not a lot of funding for community gardens. There are some like catchment system grants for farms, but they not on such a small scale. And I just worked with Tiffany to try to get a rain barrel for Neal Place, and it took so long, and they ultimately just got it as a gift from someone else. And so it's really challenging to, something as basic as needing a water source deters them from growing food for their community, right? And so Michael Banner wrote something I wanted to read. So I think that, we can supply community pooled resources, but we cannot provide them access to water. I think it is definitely something that comes up time and time again. And so if we can try to reintroduce, if someone is starting a community garden, then where's that safety net for the inputs that they need? Something as easy as just drilling and putting like a spigot out there or an access point for water is something that I think that we need institutional support on, because it's not something that's funded by extension. It's not something that's funded by the county, and I don't believe the city right now. And so that's kind of what ties back to, if there's a collective body of folks that want to expand the community garden network and they have a loud enough voice, they say, we want other folks to be involved with this, but they don't even have access to water, right? And that's like a larger issue that we need to kind of build collectively on. But at the moment, I wouldn't be able to provide them a resource besides grant funding, which is really challenging and takes a long time, or can take a long time.
So if I wanted to start a community garden, Cameron, say for example, wherever I am, located, if I wanted to start a community garden, would it be better for me to, because I know it's more than 100+ community gardens that they may not be maintained, but I know it's over 100+ community gardens in Forsyth County.
Mm-hmm.
But as a community resident, if I wanted to start a community garden, would you suggest that I would try to seek out those that have been established, or should I start my own? And if so, what would be the best way for me to initiate a community garden? What would be some of the core, values or some of the core considerations that I would need to, consider in order for me to be successful with starting a community garden long term?
Yeah, so I want to first acknowledge that Michael Banner is providing some really great content in the chat that really resonates with what we're talking about right now. And so I would encourage, I want to encourage folks who are interested in starting community gardens to start them, to take part in this kind of like paradigmatic shift, right? So the initial assumption is that a community garden is for donation, it's to feed hungry people, it's for donation, like I said, and instead shift it as a community revitalization project, right? So if you wanted to start a community garden in your area as a way of promoting self-sufficiency in communities and marginalized communities and hungry communities in Forsyth County, I think that my energy and attention and the energy of extension should be directed toward that, right? Of promoting self-sufficiency and community revitalization through gardening. And I think that the gardens that exist currently do great work in terms of immediate emergency hunger relief, but how can we shift gardening to promote a pipeline to urban farming, building those resources and those skills, because there's a lot of potential in that. If that answers your question. I think I kind of veered off a little bit based off what Michael was saying, but I did want to acknowledge that.
Let me ask you another thing. My thing is, what way do you feel as though that we can kind of interconnect different community gardens throughout the city. What evidence-based practices do you feel as though that are valuable? What works, what doesn't work in order for us to kind of connect these food systems across the county?
Right. So I think that this goes back to the fact that gardens don't really exist in conversation with each other. And so now the role of extension is to make everyone feel that that extension is a safe and accessible space for common ground. And so the way that we are kind of changing the mentor training is to have community garden leaders come together and represent their gardens and talk about food access, access to land, resource access, so that everyone who is gardening is also aware of how resources are disproportionately scattered across the county. So we first and foremost need our garden leaders to be trained and literate when it comes to equity and resource access, and then train all of our garden mentors and our garden leaders of how to lead gardens with that in mind, if that makes sense. And so first and foremost, we need the gardens to represent themselves and connect with each other in a commonly shared space. Like extension has a potential to be. It has not historically served as that, but it has the potential to kind of grow into that space so that gardens can identify, what purpose do community gardens have as a whole? They are representing diverse communities, but how can we move forward with a collective agenda in terms of the larger conversation of food access? Does that answer your question?
It does. Thank you, Cameron. I think we have another question on board. I digress.
I think we had a Christopher. Yeah,
I think, can you hear me now?
we can.
Somehow my headphones connected and they're not even near me. It's weird. Well, my question from way back, I'll do this, more or less a clarification. It's not a question, but I'm an educator, right? I'm a high school teacher. And my issue, I believe a lot of these, as far as like things we're talking about, equity and community building and understanding those sort of concepts, begins in the school, right? And with programs that have a food justice basis, right? That's the lens through which you would develop a curriculum, right? So that's my interest in community development around agriculture and education and gardening and horticulture and all those buzzwords. And I'm also glad, Cameron, you're amazing. I love your words. I love your wording, because historically, the cooperative extension has not even utilized such words as equity and inclusion and diversity. If one were to look at the foundations of cooperative extensions, especially in the southern states. So, gracias. But I want you to clarify a little bit. What do you see as culturally relevant food? You mentioned that at the very beginning, and I just wanted you to clarify a little bit. What do you mean by that? What do you see the significance of that being in terms of community gardens and neighborhood gardens, and specifically what we're talking about, maybe around the East Winston neighborhood?
Right. Yeah, that's a really helpful question, considering if you want to grow food that's culturally relevant, you also have to consider like what is able to be grown here as well, right? We can't, you can't grow bananas, you can't grow certain things here in Forsyth County that feel comfortable or accessible to folks to celebrate their cultural heritage through food. I do think that there are programs possible and that have been executed in different parts of North Carolina that highlight cultural preservation through seed saving and through identifying, moving away from the mainstream seeds that we're typically purchased or typically provided. And so where are those heirloom varieties? Where are the seeds grown that are relevant to the food histories of North Carolina residents and all the diverse communities that are represented through that, right? And that comes from community evaluation, right? Asking what kind of foods did your grandmother prepare? What kind of foods are you interested in seeing grown in your community, and working with that? What's actually realistic and what can be grown, but asking folks, what foods make you feel connected to your history, and how can we grow them? If that makes sense.
That does make sense. And it sort of was, I had a question that piggyback on that. Like, what do you like, go about discovering what a community needs? Like, how did, I guess you as the extension agent go about when you're establishing community gardens? What type of data is driving this is what this community needs in terms of food and access and those sort of things?
Yeah, that's a great question, because it's not data driven, right? It's entirely experiential, and it's very qualitative, and it's more about hearing folks, hearing their stories and storytelling, and listening to what how a community identifies themselves, and that's usually just by listening rather than coming in with any types of assumptions. And asking, those really questions that open up space for you to understand how a community identifies themselves, rather than relying on the data of, well, they fall into this demographic and this bracket, and therefore their needs are this, this, and this. One of the fundamental components of community development is just asking asking folks to draw their community, and that kind of shows. Oh, great. Thanks, Tiffany. Of asking folks to draw their community. And that kind of shows how they, did you have your hand raised, Brandon? Did you want to say something?
Yeah, I did. I was saying a lot of ways to kind of get an overview of what, needs, being indigenous to this area, we kind of know certain things that are viable and certain things that are not. As far as like different things like squash, certain things are mainstay, squash, okra, green beans, tomatoes, certain things that are mainstays, to a lot of us that are indigenous to this area, so just starting with some watermelons, melons, squash, green beans, tomatoes, okra, some of the things that are nutritionally dense, those are the kind of things that we tend to base our platform on. Certain things that kind of thrive better. If you're looking at your different growing mediums, if you want to look at a square foot growing methodology, or if you want to go through a traditional method, if you wanted to grow in hills and mounds. So it just depends on what you're accustomed to. Being in this region, what you're accustomed to kind of translates to the market demands. Like, for example, we had a lot of successful community gardens that we grow collard greens. That's one of the crops that are this is high demand. North Carolina, collard greens. We had different varieties from Williams, from Virginia that we were trying to preserve, to the Morris Haden varieties, to the Creole, to the Georgia Southern, different okra and things of that nature. So just some of the mainstays. Starting out, sometimes if keeping it basic and keeping it simple will kind of translate to profits, because a lot of people do demand these different crops in the market space. Now, if you're talking about something that's like, personally, like I like collard greens because you can get several harvests off of one yield. Outside, some people harvest the whole head, but you can get 3 or 4 harvests off of one head of collard greens, versus a cabbage, so, just looking at some of the basic formats, we can kind of get an idea of squash in this area. That's a very high demand product, and like traditionally what we do, the Three Sisters, you're dealing with corn, a vine and pole bean variety, and you're dealing with squash. So just looking at what's accustomed to this area and to this region, that'll really give you the leverage in order to enter into, if you're doing it for market, that'll kind of give you the interest to segue into those areas, because a lot of people here, we like squash, we like okra, we like collard greens. So just being able to understand what the people in this immediate vicinity demand, that's a great way to segue into that and to know what to grow, because it's different between growing for yourself and growing for others, because we may like specific things, but that may not translate to a broader spectrum. So I just keeping it traditional in this area and keeping it You know, like I said, we in this area with turnip greens, mustard greens, collard greens, things of that nature. And I'm getting some good, responses, some smiles. So we know what we like. So we're just trying to get the best of what we like to market, or to being able to have a situation or a consortium where we may have a neighbor who may just grow okra. We may have one neighbor who may just grow turnips. We may have one neighbor who may just grow squash, or whatever the case may be. But just being able to identify what the mainstays are, I think that'd be the best. That's the best way to kind of identify, even if you want to segue into a market dynamic, what the market demand is. Because a lot of people in this area, they eat on what they're accustomed to. And that's just evidence-based practice. I just want to kind of interject that into the paradigm. And a lot of the stuff that we grow, whether it's perennial or annual, we doing crop rotations. I mean, it's a great market for it. Like I said, I know some urban or community gardens who just grow collard greens. Some just grow watermelon, some grow strawberries, some grow blackberries. So just knowing what we're accustomed to and being able to, integrate into the vein of what those in this community are accustomed to, I think that's a great way to start the conversation, to initiate community garden participation, and to kind of segue it in or scale it up or down in terms of what you want to do it. So I just want to kind of interject it into the grand scheme.
Well, great. Does anyone else have any questions? Okay, we're kind of over time.
Yeah, we're actually good, still on time.
Oh, okay.
And then, like I said, when you're dealing with what you're growing, if you want to be sustainable, you want to kind of grow stuff that you can kind of get. And my thing is, I like to do more efficient type of stuff. Like if you're growing lettuce, especially we're dealing with leaf lettuce, you can kind of get several harvests. If you're growing collards, you can get several harvests. Mustard greens, you can get several harvests. So my thing is, you're looking at viability. You want to look at what you can maximize in terms of when dealing with space. Because a lot of us, if we're living in the city, we want to kind of maximize our growing space. You don't want to, if you grow a head of cabbage, which it has to head, and we growing cabbage. How much is cabbage at the market? That was 39 cents to less than $1. And that's not really feasible. Like growing corn, and corn takes a lot of nitrogen out of the soil. But if we're growing stuff like lettuce, or if we're growing things that you can kind of cut and come again, bok choy, Swiss chard, different things, you can kind of really expand and really minimize on your output in terms of grocery expenses if you integrate certain, crop growing principles that can kind of, that are sustainable and they can kind of keep you going through the next season. So those are the type of things that Extension would provide different guides, and just, being able to select certain crops and certain, even when we're dealing with different herbs and different ornamentals and things of that nature. You have certain things that are perennial and certain things that are biennial and certain things that are just annual. So just being able to access that cooperative extension as a resource. We live in this zone 7B, and I identify certain things that grow and that really flourish and thrive in this area. I think that's the best way to go in terms of really starting a garden. And then we look at companion planting. I'm a big proponent of companion planting, native pollinators, so I don't use no pesticides. So you want to kind of integrate in different types of mediums to kind of maximize your yield from more of an integrity standpoint. So it's a lot of ways. Like I said, cooperative extension, that's a wealth of underutilized resources that are affordable to the community. So they have a lot of workshops. Like Cameron said, we have a lot of different series. They have a lot of different series coming up that can kind of really educate you on how to select and how to maximize your efforts in terms of your community garden initiatives.
Thank you. Are there any other closing questions or thoughts? Well, Then I would just like to say thank you again to Cameron for being here for this session. Remind everyone from all of the sessions that we're going to be posting these onto the city's YouTube. I'm planning on doing that on Monday. And as soon as those links are up, I'll send them out to all of you all, but we'll also be shared on the city's social media page and also will be posted to the Urban Food Policy Council's webpage on the city's website. So multiple ways to access it. Feel free to share with anyone that you think needs to hear information that's been shared, I think, from the range of topics. It's really useful information and answers a lot of questions that people frequently have. So in addition to the videos, we'll be getting out kind of a questions and answer sheet that's written. And I will share that with you all as an attachment and also on the Urban Food Policy Council page. And it'll include links that have been shared so that there's also just a resource sheet. So a lot will be coming your way, and please share it far and wide. That's the purpose of these types of conversations. And just again, thank you to the Urban Food Policy Council for all the effort you put into planning this, especially Brandon and Michael. For leading the way on this. And yeah, thank you everyone for being here. I'm going to stay on for a few minutes if anyone needs anything, but I hope you have a good day. If you're interested in serving on the Urban Food Policy Council or partnering, send me an email. I'm going to pop my email in the chat. I know Christopher has already shared his information, and I will be glad to reach out to you, or you can reach out to me either way. Y'all be well.
I would like to thank everybody for coming out to making this a great event. Thank you, Cameron, for your presentation. And y'all be safe. Let's grow.
Great work, Brandon.
No problem, T. I couldn't do it without you. I appreciate your support.
Of course, of course. We'll get this posted.
All right, take care. Have a good weekend.
You too.